Well, we were continuing with lesson 45, and we're going on where Jesus was going to be brought to number 3 bad guy, which it was King Herod. But let's go back a bit. Let's go back to this guy Pontius Pilate. What kind of guy was he? I say number 2 bad guy. Well, he wasn't religious. In fact, he was very political. He represented as a governor. He was a politician. He was a bad guy politician because he was a very weak politician, because here he was going to deliver up an innocent man to be killed, to be crucified, as a political statement. Political means to stand up, for the government, There's actually a prophecy in the Bible that says the government would be on Jesus' shoulders. What was on Jesus' shoulders? The cross. The cross. That Jesus would die for the world. But here we have Pilate, being that weak man. He knew he didn't want to have another uprising. Caesar would take him out of his position and he wouldn't have a job anymore. But he was more concerned with that and his political correctness, they call it, than the truth. In fact, he didn't even let Jesus answer what truth was. Because to Pilate, there was no absolute truth. Some things are right at the time and some things are wrong, or whatever he thinks is right or wrong it is. There was no foundation for Pilate. Pilate didn't have the foundation, even that the Jews had. He had no foundation. He knew of all these weird gods, Roman gods and everything, But Pilate knew that he wanted to keep the peace politically, and so he would go beyond what he should have. He'd go beyond and do absolute wrong by putting an innocent man to death. That was Pilate, a weak man. Not only that, he had him flogged. Flogged as he had him whipped. And it was a very violent time. But let's go back to Herod, because see, we just got to the point where Pilate has sent him to Herod thinking, this guy, he's out of my jurisdiction. Great, I don't have to deal with this whole situation with the Jews. Herod can take care of it. So he brings us to the third bad guy. The third bad guy was Herod Antipas. Now, this was not the Herod that had killed his family and stuff like we talked about when Jesus was born. In fact, he had died. It was his son. But he was a puppet, just like the first Herod. When I say puppet, the Romans picked him and put him there, and the people didn't like him at all. He was an Edomite. He wasn't a Jew. Plus, the family of Herod, they were very much partiers, They were like saying that they were king, the false king. People think, oh, King Herod, and that's what they thought of him. Also, he had John the Baptist beheaded just to please his stepdaughter. How terrible is that? He wanted her to come out and dance for him, and she asked for his head. He says, okay, so he ended up, executing John the Baptist. That's the kind of guy he was. He was very weak too. But he was that guy that there's some guys and girls or women and whatever that all they want to do is just go out partying. Well, that was he. He loved to be entertained. That was Herod. So when he saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad. Why was he glad? Did he think he was God? Oh, he said, oh, look what I got here. He said, I've heard many things of this guy. He's done a lot of miracles. And he was hoping and asking for Jesus to do a miracle. And he questioned him with many words. And he said, let me see a miracle. Hey, walk across my swimming pool. Do something. Let's see something. Let's have a show tonight. And he brought in his guys and said, hey, we got Jesus here. He even raised somebody from the dead. Hey, let's see what you can do, Jesus. And Jesus did not answer. So, in the whole thing of it, he was pretty upset with Jesus just because Jesus would not answer him. And so then he brought in his his guys, you know. I don't know if he brought in his religious guys or his soldiers, or probably some of both. It says he brought in his men of war, so probably soldiers or whatever. And then he said, "Hey, you know, this is Jesus, the one that supposedly did all these miracles and stuff." And they laughed at him and they mocked him again. Just think, again he was mocked. And they put on a king's robe, you know, this beautiful robe that Herod had there, and Herod allowed them to spit on him again. He was spit on again. They pretended to bow to him and said, "Hail, King! Hail, King!" Oh, and then after they were finished laughing and partying up, they sent him back to Pilate. It says that same day that he sent him back to Pilate and Herod, who were arch enemies, they did not get along. Pilate was the governor of Roman government, and King Herod was so supposedly be the king of the Jews, the puppet king of the Jews. They never got along. But when he brought Jesus and brought back to Pilate and was laughing about it, and Pilate too, they became friends. You know how evil people like to get together against someone, and they don't get along, but suddenly they're like, "Oh, let's get together. We're both in the same boat with this situation against Jesus." It's pretty terrible. It's pretty terrible so far, isn't it? It's hard for me to even go on. But as I go on, I have to go on because you need to know what happened. It goes back to Pilate. And so Pilate calls together the chief priests again and the rulers and the Jews, which are following Jesus the whole time, even to Herod. And he says, "I find no fault with him, and neither does Herod. He has done nothing wrong of death. But I will scourge him just for you, just so you'll feel that I did something." And so he would take him to get whipped. That is such an awful thing. What for? What would Jesus say? Did they whip him for some reason? So he would confess or something? No, just to please the Jews. Sorry, here. Okay, got something coming up. Just to please them. And so they cried out, "Crucify him! Away with this man!" And Pilate knew the Passover they could release a prisoner. They still wanted Jesus to be crucified. And so Pilate said, "Well, I'll get a really bad guy, this Barabbas and everything. He's a murderer and everything. We'll bring him out. And then they'll put him and I'll put Jesus, and they can choose which one that they want to let go." And of course they're going to pick Jesus. He hasn't done anything, has no fault. Well, they didn't. Guess who they picked to be set free? Barabbas, the murderer. And to Jesus they said, "Crucify him, crucify him." And the crowd started getting bigger and bigger, and they were yelling, "Crucify him." And so Pilate then delivered him to be scourged. And that, when I say that whipping, it wasn't just a normal whip. At the end of the whip, they put pieces of metal on it. It was terrible to be whipped that many times. 40 lashes of whipping Jesus was so terrible for no good reason. And then after he was whipped, the soldiers took him again, numbered 3 times. Clear back with the trial they did this, and then with Herod, and now with Pilate, the soldiers take him, and they take thorns, and they make a crown of thorns, and they pound the thorns into his head. They put a scarlet, purplish robe on him, just like Herod did back when, and put this robe on him, and they yelled, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they hit him with their hands, just like they did before, just like they did at the trial. He was hit again. And then Pilate brought him out. He's looking very terrible, scourged, barely able to stand up, I'm sure. And Pilate says, "I find no fault in him." And Pilate says, "Behold the man. And they called out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And he said to him, no, he was trying to set him free. And they said, we have a law that he ought to die because he made himself God. And then Pilate became more afraid when they said he made himself a God. Why would he become afraid? Because he knew about the gods. Was he really a God? You know? He said, and so he brought Jesus in again privately, and he said, "Who are you?" And Jesus did not answer him this time. And Pilate says, "Speak you not to me? You're not going to speak to me? Know not that I have the power to crucify you, or I have the power to release you." And Jesus says, this is something very amazing that Jesus says. He said, "You have no power except what has been given from me, from above, given from me from above." So Jesus was saying, no, you don't have the power. God has the power. And really, he has the power because he's God. He said, the only power you have is what my Father in heaven has given you. So Pilate sought to release him again. But the Jews kept saying, "Crucify him." And then they said, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. He is making himself a king and a god against Caesar." That was a problem. That was the weakness of Pilate, because he knew that he didn't want to get in trouble from Caesar. So it was about the 6th hour, and Pilate said, "Okay, you guys, behold your king. Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priest says, "We have no king but Caesar." And they all yelled, "Crucify him." And so then they delivered Jesus away to be crucified. Caiaphas, the religious high priest, number 1 bad guy. Number 2 bad guy, Pontius Pilate. Political bad guy, had to be politically correct. Herod, King Herod, partying away, not caring about much but being entertained. 3 bad guys. There really was another bad guy, and that was Judas Iscariot. And that was the saddest of situations, because he was one of Jesus' disciples and closest friends, and he had betrayed him. For those 30 pieces of silver, he goes back into the temple, and he's sad. He doesn't repent and turn around, but he's sad. He throws the money. So Sanhedrin takes the money, and they said, "What are we going to do with this blood money?" And so they buy a potter's field. When I think of that, I think that even the blood money, God buying that potter's field, because the Bible says that we are like clay pots. You see, when you think of all these things, the illegal trial and he's innocent and declared anyway, and flogged for no reason, and mocked and hit and all these things. Jesus could have called down angels, legions of angels. When you think of one angel can destroy like 185,000 soldiers. He had the power. He had the power right there to say, no, we'll call him down, and to protect him and defend him. But he was looking to the cross. He was looking beyond the cross to you and I. You see, as evil as these men were, Jesus died for the evil sin in us. In fact, on the cross, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." That's Jesus. That's grace. So we're going to go on to Jesus being taken to the cross and to the tomb. And then we're going to have a great celebration, celebrating when Jesus rose from the dead.